Hello, welcome to Anti-Racism, a brave space conversation about whiteness. I am Elizabeth Van Layson, the nonprofit coach, and I am really excited to have Diana Clegg here as our facilitator on this conversation about whiteness today. Just a little bit about me, if you'd move the slide on, Diana, is that I have a team of people that help nonprofits to achieve their fundraising and mission goals. And my personal mission is to create a fairer, more equitable and inclusive world filled with empathy and beauty. So today is definitely part of that. And I hope that, actually, I know that your participation today is actually part of me fulfilling my goals. So thank you for allowing me to do that. All right, I'm going to move this over to Diana and she can introduce herself.
Hello, thank you all so much for coming. It's really a great opportunity. So I'm Diana Clegg. I'm a nonprofit consultant right now. I've worked in the nonprofit field for about 25 years in a lot of work in the anti-violence movement and also in the theater arts and mental health. Those are kind of the main areas that I've worked in the past. With respect to my work around anti-racism, a lot of that I have been doing personally and voluntarily. To me, it is just an incredibly important piece of my life right now. And I feel like I want as many people as possible to be a part of that. I feel like all of us who are working towards anti-racism are on an anti-racism journey. And I certainly do not consider myself to be an expert, but I want to be a facilitator of conversations where we can learn from each other. And I feel like those of us who are interested, we are all on that journey and we're all in different places and we all know different things and have had different experiences. So in every conversation, I'm always learning something. So that's a little bit about me. I don't know if Elizabeth wanted to say anything else before we jump into some of the content.
I think I loved when we first started having conversations about the webinar and what we wanted to create. And I consider Diana an expert. I just want to say that. But I also love that she doesn't. It helps me to see that this conversation isn't about a destination. One of the things I'm giving up this year in 2020 is the idea of being a good person, and to know that that is something so much bigger than where I am at this year in my life, and hopefully where I'll be in 40 years is going to be at a different place. But just knowing that for all of us are on that journey, and if we don't have to think that we're already a good person, then we can also look at the things that we do or don't do that don't work. So, and I hope we'll take that spirit into this conversation.
Yes. And just in following up with what Elizabeth said, just to give you a little bit of sort of insight into kind of how I got into doing this work or being interested in this work. I believe it really first started probably about 20 years ago when I was working at the YWCA, and I was involved in an exercise. It was an anti-racism workshop at our workplace, and you may have even done something similar like this, but basically everybody like stands in a line and everybody was holding hands, and then the facilitator would make a statement, and if that statement was true for you, you would walk forward, and if it wasn't, you would do a step backward. And basically it was various kinds of statements like, did you have books in your household growing up? Or did you have were you ever hungry as you were growing up? Have you ever been discriminated against or, called hateful names because of the color of your skin? So there'd be all these different kinds of statements, and you'd either walk forward or walk backward, depending on it. And I had a young black woman whose hand I was holding at the time, who worked in another program. And we just kept going farther and farther and farther apart until finally we couldn't hold hands anymore because she kept going backward and I kept going forward. And it just had, it still affects me every time I tell the story because it just showed, it was such a visceral feeling of how our experiences in life were so different. And so I think that was really my first awareness, and where I started to, try to learn more and become more educated around it, and, doing the things that I kind of thought were, that I was being an anti-racist, and so fast forward that to about 5 years ago, and I reconnected with this woman, and she said something to me, which really was, again, a huge awakening moment, where she's like, how do I know you're anti-racist? What are you doing that tells me that? What in your life is telling me what you believe in? She's like, I've looked through your Facebook page, and I don't see anything that tells me anything about how you feel, or just in the conversations that we had. And I realized that it was all the stuff that was in my head that I was thinking, oh, I'm non-racist in my head. And how's that helping anyone? Well, it's not. And I don't know nearly as much as I think I know. And so once again, she sort of spurred me into action and sort of set me off on another path of being more active, along with doing more learning, and really realizing I was not nearly as far as I thought I was. I thought it would be helpful just to start sort of with the definition of racism that I use, which is essentially a system advantage, which is based on race. Another way of looking at it is the subordination of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. BIPOC, that might be an acronym that you're seeing more of now. It's a newer one that people are utilizing more often to try to identify that Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color can have very different experiences in our culture. And so I think that's why they've moved to utilizing this particular acronym to be more clear about what people are saying. So the subordination of Black, Indigenous, and people of color by white people. Another way of simplifying a definition is prejudice plus power. So a lot of people might think of racism as being, I, white person, am prejudiced against you, Black person, but it's really more than that. Because me, one single person, only has a very minimal amount of impact on you, Black person, in your life. But when you look at the whole system of our country and how it was created, and all of the laws and all of the sort of cultural norms, but that's a whole nother layer. So having that power, and that's where a lot of the problem lies. I'll just pause there for a moment and say, is that definition of racism where you're at, or what you've been thinking, or do you have any other thoughts or additional things to say about how you would define it?
Hi, Diana. Thank you.
Hi.
It's good to see you again.
You too.
I look at it as not so much a system, because that suggests that there's a coordinated effort. I would say that it's like everything else, it's dysfunctional in terms of its ability to coordinate, but its impact appears to be systemic. And the only reason it's not worse is because of our dysfunctionality, within our system of government, and well, let's say the corruption that drives it, special interests. It is a systematized. It's the use of systems and the systemization of, it's more of a verb approach rather than a noun.
Okay.
That's how I think about it. Because if you look at the laws and policies that have been implemented to create the hurdles, to contain, because these are the control words that are used by those that don't want it to spread. And they look at it as something that is abhorrent to what they perceive as, whatever purity or their focus. And by any means necessary, this is very typical of the kinds of things that have put in place. If you look at Native Americans, you can just look at where we began and the laws and hurdles that have been put in place to contain them, to the point where they're on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see where that led to.
Mm-hmm.
There's too many Black people to contain them and put them on reservations, thank God. But it's still, it's the systematic approach that's been used to control and to contain at every step, economically, politically, certainly, socially, and anything that goes against that system of control is where we see the outbreaks of, well, protest, violence, you name it. And at some point, the containment, overspills, because we're seeing when there are means of force to control and to contain, it spills over. This is a direct, the police are a direct reflection of our society, let's face it.
Right.
Anyway, that's how I look at it, more from a verb down, if that helps.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely.
So as you were talking, Jeffrey, I was thinking about how one of the things that I've been, reading from Black Voices and whatnot is that the system, like the idea of the system, is more so that even if all of us in society were anti-racist, there are still barriers built into the systems we have in place in society that would keep BIPOC populations down, essentially, that would keep them marginalized. And so I just think it's worth putting that out there, that essentially, like the systemic racism, that when I hear that, I think it's not just people. In fact, it's less people maybe than it is the systems we've created in our country that all on their own are racist.
Well, yes. When you look at loans to people that are either poor or Black, we know that the literal systems have rules built in to restrict, contain, control. So the behaviors that we have brought and we've put into our policies have found themselves into the systems. And of course, as more and more technology is brought to bear, the concern is what are the goals and constraints built into those systems that will increasingly and more rapidly control and contain. That is the underlying concern around all the, march forward with technology, to your point, Katie.
Yeah, and one of the things too that I always talk about when in conversation around doing anti-racism work is that you have to kind of think of it in a twofold way. Like, one, the action-oriented piece. It's great to become more educated, more informed. That's one piece. But then the other piece is actually, okay, so then how do you use that to actually start dismantling all of these systems that are in place that we continue to perpetuate without even realizing it, because we don't see it. It's so built in, it's all around us. And so I think that both of those pieces are so important for us to always keep in mind. Let me move to the next screen here. So what does it mean to be white? Because essentially, that's what we're talking about. We live in a culture that is a white supremacy culture. When you think about whiteness, we are unmarked. I liked that word when I read that, when somebody described it that way. If you are a white person, you're unmarked in this world. You're the default. You're the norm. You're not the other. It's people of color who are always the other in our culture. So we can kind of walk through this world and be, not seen as unusual or different. We can go freely into, most spaces, parks, public buildings, beaches, anywhere we go in this world, we're the default. were the norm in the United States. I'll stick with that. And one of the things that I think has become more recognized is that folks nowadays, many have been raised on the idea of being colorblind, and that being colorblind is a good and a positive thing, and that is something to show that you're anti-racist because you say that you don't see race. Whereas in actuality, that just sort of, it just perpetuates this same culture, is because by being colorblind, we're saying, we don't see you, we don't see what your life is like because of the color of your skin and how different it is from what my life is like. I'm not recognizing that. I'm not seeing it. I'm not talking about it. It's, you know, it's erasure, complete erasure. And I think so many of us grew up that way and have been taught that, and that's a positive thing. What have some of you folks, in terms of how you were raised, does this kind of view of what it means to be white, is that kind of how you grew up in the world?
I think, I was gonna say, I'd like to model some, vulnerable sharing and say that, like, I was definitely raised, with this, like, colorblind idea that, it's like we're all the same underneath, and it sounds really good, right? I think it makes a lot of sense. But I think, over the years, I've started to see the cracks in that. And I remember, I was in college, and one of my close friends, and she was African American, and there was a guy who was a student, and he also worked in like the food services or whatever. And just because of the coloring of his skin and the hat that he wore and his beard, I did not recognize him as being African American. I think I thought he was Islamic, and she had said something about him being black, and I was like, what, he's black? And she was like, yeah. And then she started to get angry with me, and I realized I had gotten defensive, and I was like, oh, I don't see color, and I just got like really defensive, and I just never just said like, oh, I thought he was Islamic. I just wouldn't like admit what was going on, and I didn't want to appear prejudiced, and I didn't really understand why she was angry, and I just got really defensive and started, and just even when I said like, oh, I don't see color, I guess she was just like, and I was like, and I didn't really have like a great way of responding at that time. And so I just, wanted to share, like, that's my experience of that.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's a parallel here between, and then this is going to sound a little odd maybe, but between that ignorance and around the racism and trying to just be colorblind, to your point, Diana, and how we view technology. In both cases, we sort of abstract ourselves from the underlying complexities and try to look at things simplistically. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about, and especially around the systemic concerns, these things have been done at very granular details for decades and built in. These aren't things that are just sort of like meandering across the landscape and taking hold. They've been carefully planted and nurtured, and they've been, there's been a lot of thought at every single level. People don't understand just the complexity of how everything is put together in our society to manage and control everything about it. And the same thing is with our technology. We don't understand how it all manifests itself. My own personal perspectives are, yeah, I grew up in a white area, insulated from all of the other race. And I did work in the city, on the South Side, for a number of years as I was putting myself through school and otherwise. And I had a lot of friends, and I enjoyed the friendships I made and the camaraderie with other races, especially Black. And I grew to understand what they were dealing with and the acceptance that they have of their place, knowing they can't change anything because of all of the systemic challenges. And as I started to peel them back, I had a greater appreciation for all the things you're talking about, all of those systematized things that have been put in place. And there are thousands and thousands of obstacles, way more than anyone even realizes. And because people don't see them any more than they understand the underlying technologies that are used to manipulate our consent and our behaviors for profit and otherwise, it's the same level of abstraction and simplicity. And I agree with you. We need to really peel it back and look at it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, Jeff, listening to your comments, because my experience was so different, I think. Even though I mostly grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and most of the environment was white, my parents are originally from South Africa, and they left in 1963 when they got married because they didn't want to live in an apartheid society and they didn't want to raise children there. They moved to Israel, which is where I was born. And so, you know, when you look sort of, for me, historically growing up with, you know, with apartheid and with anti-Semitism and everything else, you've certainly seen this across the board. But I think what's interesting is, you know, how little it was a conversation when I was growing up. It was really something that wasn't talked about very much, not only in terms of black and white, but in terms of all kinds of prejudice and things like that. It was, right, the language was fairly vulgar by today's standards, right? You look at a show like All in the Family, you know, and then you think about Archie Bunker and the prejudice and everything that is shown there. But what's interesting, I think, when you hear the dialogue is how many people want to dictate, and Diana, this is what I liked about what you said, sort of dictate that this is what needs to happen to make a change, and not listen to everybody involved in the process.
Yeah.
Well, one of the, so I'm an old white guy, and, as you may have noticed, and the world is full of old white guys who talk too much and don't listen enough. And so I'm here to listen. And to answer your question was not a question of what I see in the perspective of other people, but how I was raised.
Sure.
And somebody once pointed out to me that a person of color, that when I was raised and when I left the house every morning, I was never told that I was a white person. I never left the house as a white person. I never was looking for a job as a white person. I never did anything as a white person.
Right.
That this person, this one person who I spoke to, was like, when I leave the house, it's every day I'm black. When I go and apply for a job, I ask, is this something that a black person can do? So that is one distinction that I did get, is that I was white and didn't know it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think I would imagine that most of us, or a lot of us, were raised in that way because we are the default. You know, we're the norm. We're unmarked. We are, you know, we. Yeah, identified by our color or by our race. So something that comes up a lot more these days is talking about white privilege and what exactly that means and who exactly has white privilege. Oops, sorry, it skipped ahead there. And so the easiest way that I talk about it is it's an unearned system of white. That's essentially what white privilege is. And I know sometimes folks have a hard time with the word privilege, particularly maybe if they grew up in an environment that didn't feel very privileged. Maybe they were very poor growing up, or feel like in their life they did not experience much privilege. But we're really just talking about what kind of privilege do you get just from the color of your skin that's unearned, just by virtue of the color of your skin. It doesn't have anything to do, with how you were raised, what your socioeconomic background is. And different people have much different experiences in life, some better, more positive, and some less so. But this just simply speaks to the color of skin and what a difference that can make in your life. It's the power of being normal. It's the power of getting the benefit of the doubt, something I think we see a lot nowadays with more highlight on the violence against particularly Black people in our culture and through the police, and how so often you'll see a white person in a very similar situation to a Black person and they get the benefit of the doubt, whereas the Black person doesn't. And it's just because of the color of their skin. So just by virtue of being born white in this culture, we all have white privilege. Whether we want it or not, we have it. And so then it's, what do we do with it? In terms of some of your all's experience, what do you think are some of the areas where you have noticed white privilege, or where it's been hard to kind of get a grasp on what white privilege is for yourself? Anyone?
Well, I definitely would like to hear from some of the people who haven't spoken yet, and I'll just, jump in and kind of start it. I've noticed for myself, I can really whip up a resume. My resume is amazing. And, but I've noticed, I think, like with my name, with my background, certain educational things, like certain addresses, I think they kind of weave together a story of privilege. And I find that, I've had situations where I knew I wasn't right for a job, and I had to kind of be like, I'm really not the right person for you. You need somebody with a little bit more experience. And I really think that, I think for me, it's like that thing of like being good on paper and being able to kind of walk in and be that person kind of from like the kind of name that you have and the skin color you have and a certain kind of background, I think to me is like several different layers of privilege just weave together on a piece of paper for someone to be like, you've got the stamp, you're in, or you don't and you're not. That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm.
I can.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I can just give you one. We've all been there. I can drive into the city at night without concern. Period. I don't worry that I'm going to get arrested, stopped, or whatever. If I'm driving a nice car, I don't have a concern. A good friend of mine, he's Black. He's careful about driving in the city and which car he takes and when he goes.
Mm-hmm.
That's all you need to say.
Yeah, I think I was personally struck more recently too with the, I don't know if those of you who saw it in the newspaper about the man who was doing, the Black man who was doing the bird watching, and the woman he had asked her to.
Hey, Diana, you're breaking up a little bit. I wonder if maybe turning off your video, because I think what you're saying is really important.
Okay, hold on. But so there was that situation, and I was talking with another Black person about that, and just about here's this guy in a park bird watching, having asking somebody calmly if you could please put your dog on a leash, which was the rule, and then it blew up into this huge police encounter, and them saying, well, all parks are white, all forest preserves are white, all beaches are white, every sort of public space that you can think of they're all white, you know, and if you're not white, you have to really be thinking about your safety, or just, are you going to be accepted in that space, or how you walk in that space. And I had honestly really never thought about that. But I've been looking around me a lot more now since that, and like, who is around me? And realizing again just how white those spaces are.
I think that's a great example. And I want to share some of what's in the chat, since some people have been very active in there. Roy says it's going to be an important topic at the Sports Philanthropy World Conference, October 26th through the 27th. And Rebecca Kendrick, who's from Virginia Community Voice, they do fantastic work around this issue. So feel free to jump in, Becca. But she shared a resource on here that we can email out to everyone afterwards. That looks like on white supremacy culture that people are finding really helpful. And Katie has shared that, she really feels like her success in life was never questioned. And the assumption was always that she was going to do well, and that she would have the resources to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Hey, Diana, this is David.
Hi, David.
Good to see you. Thanks for
You too.
helping to lead this with Elizabeth. I'll jump in and add one thing. And, obviously I agree with what everyone else has said. And you don't need to say much more than what you just, what you and I think Jeff said. If you can't drive, just drive a car in this country without having extra considerations, a lot of extra considerations, city or suburbs, it's outrageous. And that's something that white people don't even think about. And I don't know that you can distill it down more than that. But of course, bird watching or being in a park, it's just another example. Let me just quickly tell you about another area which I'm now working in. I don't know if you saw this, Diana. I talked to Elizabeth about this, but I'm working now part-time while I'm looking for my next legal job, full-time legal job. I'm working part-time to help a startup that's in the employment space. It's called RiseKit. The startup's called RiseKit. Okay. And I'll put it in the chat. More information about it. The mission of RiseKit, it's for profit. It's software that is looking to transform the employment ecosystem for underserved populations, and thus it's really a LinkedIn on steroids for underserved job seekers, entry-level job seekers. Through my engagement with them over the last couple months, I've come to realize more than ever what it's like to seek employment as a person of color, and the various barriers to entry into the workforce that white people, for the most part, don't have to contend with. And it starts with simply even understanding how a resume is made and what a resume is all about. And in so much of the white world, in the more privileged world, you have education or networks that tell you what you're supposed to do in any number of ways. Oftentimes it's just through osmosis, but there are so many communities, especially people of color, who don't have that occurring. They aren't exposed to that. And thus white people assume that people of color are going to come to the table with the proper resume, in the proper way of conducting themselves in a workspace, perhaps, or I won't even use proper, but what white people are accustomed to. Right. And there's no reason why they would have had that exposure. But white people don't realize that there's a huge segment of the population that just never had the opportunity to learn how to engage in the quote unquote mainstream workforce. And so that's what RiseKit is all about. It's obviously not just resume building, it's attacking other barriers to entry like criminal history and the like. But the whole, just engaging in the workforce is an area that white people and again, there are white people that don't have a lot of benefits of other white people. So I don't mean to break it down just by race, but underserved populations typically are disproportionately people of color.
Right. That's great that you're doing that work, David. I had not heard that. That's great. And that's a very good example as well. Another term that you may have heard lately that's become more popular is white fragility. And, what exactly is white fragility? What does that mean? I don't feel very fragile. What's this white fragility? And so basically the way I look at it is it's a social environment that protects and insulates from race-based stress. So me as a white person, my social environment very much protects me from being stressed out about race in any way. And so therefore, because of that, I'm not used to talking about race, and I become defensive and uncomfortable about discussing anything that's, about racial inequality or injustice, because I have not had to have that conversation. I've not grown up having to worry about that, just like David was talking about. And so therefore, it makes me very defensive and uncomfortable. And so that's really what the term white fragility is talking about. It's being uncomfortable, and you can see on the little icon here the tears, crying and being upset because perhaps you've just learned that you did something that was a racist act and you didn't realize that it was, and somebody called you out on it. And so what happens is that upsets you because you're not used to talking about this or being called out, and you're uncomfortable. And, so there are the tears that are coming. And so then what happens is everybody's focus and energy turns to you, the white person who's crying, to try to make you feel better. And the racist act that you did, gets put on the back burner. So that's a real important piece, I feel like, for we as white people. The more that we talk about it, and the more courageous conversations that we have about it, and the more open we are to hearing that something that we have done is racist, even though we didn't realize it, that we're able to be open and hear it and not just become defensive. Does anyone have any examples of where that's happened, where maybe you have felt some white fragility? Maybe you've said something or done something and somebody called you out on it and said, hey, that felt like a racist remark to me, or anything along those lines where you experienced some of that?
I think I'll share on this that this summer, actually, I was taking a webinar, and it wasn't specifically something I said, but one of the speakers was very critical about the way the world of philanthropy works. Mm-hmm. And she was a woman of color, and she was critiquing really, I think, the baked in layers of white privilege that were inside that system. But I've spent 20 plus years in this system. It's really important to me. I know lots of good people in it who are trying to, make the world better, have worked on the front lines of a lot of these issues. But I think where I felt myself feeling this rising heat of anger and defensiveness was there were particular ideas that I'd worked really hard to get put into our systems to make sure we were more accountable and there was more data. And the way that she was talking about, but I had to really kind of just let those waves of feelings go and listen to what she was saying. And it gave me more to think about for, quite a while afterwards than many other things, because I was able to see I can still believe in data and accountability and the things that are really important to me, and recognize that there are ways data and accountability have shut people out of philanthropy and dollars, and that it doesn't have to be an or. Mm-hmm. There might be a lot of different ways that we could be bringing data and accountability and bringing in more people of color in leadership positions who are making funding decisions and all kinds of things, so that it all goes hand in hand, and to kind of to really to let that go, and that there are ways that those have created obstacles for people. So that was, I think, my most recent experience of that.
Anyone else have any experiences around this? Or observed it, even if maybe it didn't happen to you personally, saw something like this happen?
I mean, anecdotally, yes, I have seen it in stores, in the way people behave. People are feeling, I mean, white people, let's face it, are feeling like something's going to change. They're already dealing with enough change, and this is like one more thing, and they're feeling encroached upon, whether it's masking or whatever else. I mean, the behaviors are everywhere, and everyone's, you know, if they're not tribal, they're individual, and they're feeling, you know, they're responding verbally and otherwise.
I'm going to share some of what's in the comments here in the chat. So Dawn is mentioning from springboard to opportunities, that what COVID-19 is doing is exposing the severe economic inequalities that exist in our country for everyone to bear witness to. The emergency existed before the virus is just accelerating it. And I think that goes to, like, you know, some of what Jeffrey was just talking about, is that there is, I think we're all contending with a lot of change, and but it really is revealing some of the things that maybe were just terms for people before, that they can actually see it happening in real time. And social media has helped with that a lot. And David shared out about Rise Kits, so thank you again. We can put that in an email that we can send out afterwards. And Becca, who has so much experience in this, she says she can't easily speak up because she's a 9-month-old babbling in the background. But she did say that her white fragility really started showing up when she left a large white-led philanthropic organization and started working with a small black-led nonprofit. It took about a year of feeling uncomfortable, out of place, and as if no one operated the same way as me in the workplace, to realize that it was because I've grown up in organizations rooted in white supremacy culture. The org I now work for tries to work against white supremacy culture. And for me, this means unlearning everything I know about nonprofits.
Right.
Such a great point, Becca. And Jamie says that she has a wonderful resource for her own personal work, is Resma Menakem's book, I don't know if I said that correctly, My Grandmother's Hand, and he specifically calls on white folks to understand their own trauma and how that affects our ability to do anti-racism work. I think that's really interesting. I think, you know, you mentioned earlier, Diana, about people who've had, you know, who feel maybe disadvantaged in other ways. Right. These are the people that I hear reacting most angrily to these concepts of white fragility, or, you know, white privilege. They're like, I don't feel privileged. Right. I feel really disadvantaged and I'm mad. And now everyone's calling me out just for the way I'm born and my colors and my gender, and just feeling angry. Right. And I think there is a lot of unresolved trauma there that gets in the way of that conversation. And, you know, sometimes I'm like, and imagine if you were then also Black, you know, on top of all that, you know, like, imagine, like, can you add another layer of disadvantage to your experience and see what that might feel like?
Exactly. Exactly.
Becca says it's been hard, but also very rewarding. It's made me realize just how toxic white supremacy culture is and how nonprofit culture upholds it through norms like perfectionism. This is something I want to learn a lot more about. Either or thinking, comfort with white leadership, fear of conflict, paternalism, etc.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to do a focused conversation around that too, because that's a big piece. Absolutely. And I think, you know, in thinking about white fragility, I appreciate the terminology or thinking about sort of having a lack of racial stamina, and that as white people, we need to have more stamina. We need to be able to take it more and be able to be humble and to listen to other people who have different experiences and, you know, believe their experiences, and just say, I'm sorry if we've done something that, no, we didn't intend to say something that was racist, but we did perhaps, or do something, and just take it and apologize and learn from and move on. You know, building up that racial stamina, I think, is helpful, really helpful in doing this work. So how does understanding whiteness help to combat racism? I think I've heard from several people of color that, you know, whenever people are talking about race, they tend to be talking about, you know, what Black people's lives are like, or other people of color and what their experience is. But what we really don't understand is our own whiteness and what we do. And just by being in a room, what does that mean? What are those dynamics? And how important it is for us to understand our own whiteness. And so, as I was just saying, you know, listening to and believing, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, amplifying their voices, understanding that seeing skin color and what its impact really means. I've noticed that myself a lot more now, going into rooms where there may be more people of color than white people, and like, what does me just being in the room, a presence, you know, with white skin, you know, what is that? How are people feeling about that? What is that saying to them? What, you know, just being aware of that. And again, to increase your racial stamina, that all of those kinds of things are going to be hugely beneficial in doing this work, you know, for your own personal life and personal journey, as well as in the workplace. You know, that many of us in our workplaces are trying to really kind of start breaking down all of those white supremacist structures that are in place, and make it a more welcoming environment for people of color within the workplace. So in thinking about resources, one thing that I always like to talk about is that the educating yourself is really important, and not just going immediately and asking somebody about their experiences, a friend or a colleague. I mean, I've certainly made this mistake myself, but not every person of color really wants to necessarily talk about something with you about racism and teach you about it. And there are lots of resources out there now, which is really great. And some people have been great about putting it in the chat. And we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with lots of resources as well. So continue to put some in the chat if you have additional ones. What have you been finding in your own life, either for your own personal journey or for within your workplace? What are some other things that you have really found to be helpful in terms of, you know, educating yourself or finding resources?
I'm just going to read out some of what's in the chat since there's so much great stuff in here. So Becca said that actually her organization is doing a training next week, which, having worked with Becca, I would highly recommend. Jeffrey Walk says there's a great interview with Professor Eddie Glaude Jr. Don't know how to say that name. He's got the link in there. And Jamie has mentioned that there's a great organization out of Seattle called Community-Centric Fundraising that's working on changing the way we look at fundraising. So that answers some of what we've been talking about there. And Katie's mentioned Rachel Cargill shares amazing resources by email newsletters, racial affinity group using Ruth King's book, Mindful of Race. So many great things being shared here.
That's great. And I wanted to point out, somebody had mentioned affinity groups, which are, I think, great opportunities to be in conversation with other white people who have had varying levels of experience, in doing anti-racism work, and how valuable that can be. I know personally, I joined a group about 4 years ago, a group of women that we meet monthly for 2 hours, and we talk about experiences that are happening in our own lives and what we're doing about them and how to be more effective anti-racist. And we also do role playing around like scenarios. So if a racist scenario happens around us, what would we do in that situation? And we can practice, because many of us have not, that's not a skill that we've built up over time. And that's been hugely beneficial to me. So finding other anti-racist white mentors or affinity groups can be very beneficial.
Diana, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
And this could be for the whole group of folks. I'm just curious if there are any resources out there that are trying to figure out ways of establishing qualifications for elected officials at every single level that say you must be able to do these functional things, but you also need to have some of these socially important capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And those need to drive the decisions you make around policy, because we can all be friends, but if the system is already set, they're still screwed.
Right. Right. We definitely have to be dismantling the systems along the way. I do not know of anything happening specifically along those lines. I don't know if anyone else in the group has heard of any.
I mean, even the interviews and debates that are held are all, almost PC'd to the point where you can't even ask questions like that. And it's like, no, these are exactly like you said before. We need to peel it back and look at ourselves.
Yep.
And say, okay, who is this person?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I really think it's about we as individuals, holding people accountable and asking those questions, in the political realm, it's up to each of us, I think, to be more active along those lines, because I don't know that there's anything happening at that level yet. Now, there are probably conversations going on in some arenas, but no, I mean, we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot to be done in that, because you're right that it should be required, that we should be.
I had another question too, and I think it's along the lines of like not asking your friends or colleagues. So I think beyond not asking about their own experiences, I think sometimes like I feel tripped up when I wonder, so if I have friends who are African American, like if I want to talk about how I'm feeling about a particular news story, or if I want to talk about something involving race, I don't know whether I'm being kind and helpful and that I'm opening something up that could be in the air, or if I'm actually like it's something somebody doesn't want to think about right now, and it's like, why are you bringing this up? And so I guess I wondered, is there etiquette around that?
Yeah, I would say first, if you're sharing like an emotion or a feeling that you're having around something that maybe you read about or heard about and it was upsetting to you, I think sharing that and providing an opportunity for someone else to jump in and talk about it is fine. I think you have to kind of do a little bit of reading of the room, as to how much they want to engage in conversation with you, because it could just depend on how many other conversations they've already had about it. You know, maybe it's the first one, and so then they're like, okay, cool, you know, let's see, we can have this conversation. Or maybe it's the fourth one they've had that day, or they've been on Facebook all day, you know, or people are upset about it and they don't have any more bandwidth to talk about it. And, you know, you can always just ask too, you know, are you comfortable talking about this with me right now? If not, that's totally cool. But it was really bothering me. And so, yeah. You know, when in doubt, just ask.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's been a hard one for me to learn to navigate too, because you want to share and talk with your, you know, friends or with colleagues about these kinds of issues, and you can get to a place, but finding out from them sort of what their limits are, or what they want to talk with you about or not talk with you about, and being open to that, I think is just really important.
I think that makes sense. Becca's got a good answer here. She says, I think it's about centering. As white people, we need to avoid centering ourselves in our own experience, needs, emotions in conversations with Black friends and colleagues. I think that's true. And I think sometimes too, like it can come off or be virtue signaling as well. You know, like I'm one of the good ones. So
right.
yeah, just
why
like trying
do
to like
I want to talk to them about it? Right. Is that for me? Is it for my own self? Or right. Or am I just, yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay, so David said he has to jump off, but he wanted to throw out a critical topic that needs to be in the mix and addressed in conjunction with getting a large segment of white people to understand privilege. If you've spoken with enough folks who are less empathetic about race, yeah, that's for sure. Hold on, I skipped really quickly. About race, then you have heard this from them. Many of these people have a racist tinge lens that approaches any conversation like this by seeing Black people and other people of color, as already benefiting from affirmative action and other initiatives, as having plenty of time to pull themselves up from the bootstraps already, and thus this must be on them, i.e. they are lazy after 150 years. My point is that this all needs to be addressed holistically. In my experience, explaining white privilege will only get you so much traction with people who have other narratives that need to be reframed. I think that is such an excellent point. I think there's so much fear-based conversation right now. It is really hard, I think, to have conversations with people who are really coming from an incredibly different point of view, not just like, oh, I thought I was a good person, but maybe I'm doing some things, but like, you know, a certain group of people are not as good, they're doing something wrong, they're, you know, benefiting. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Anyone?
I think that this is parallel to the conversation around entitlements, right? Everybody talks about entitlements, and it's like those people get all the breaks and everything else. I think you hear the same kinds of things about people being lazy that are, you know, that don't make enough money, and they're just, you know, when they're poor. It's because the people don't have a clue that they work 3 jobs. And if anybody's lazy, it's people that are able to go to work from the luxury of their home. And many of us are able to do work and make plenty of money and not worry about having to go into the city and risk our lives because we're quote unquote first responders or, you know, the like. There's no appreciation for any of that. And a lot of the elected officials, they have no idea what labor, the term labor even means. They live in a completely different world. So, and many of them don't go out beyond Washington. So they have no clue. They drive past the, you know, the deprived areas, or they're quickly skirted away from them in vehicles and in, you know, mass transit that are privately taking them to their offices. There's no connectedness. I think David's point about talking with people, dialoguing. We don't dialogue. We argue, we protest. You don't see, I mean, look at how many times the town halls have been shut down by quote unquote leaders when people are saying, we want to talk about things, and they're disengaged. What does that tell you? So yeah, there's a big problem. And I mean, a lot of it just comes down to basically talking to people and understanding where they're at and the challenges that they face.
Right. Validating them for their own experiences,
Yep.
and then helping them to see that if they are white, okay, so imagine all these experiences you've had and being Black on top of it, like Elizabeth had said before. But yes, finding ways to find that common ground and validating their experiences. Absolutely. And their fears.
And I know we have to wrap up. I think one of the things that was an interesting fact I'd read now a long time ago was that the majority of people on welfare are white women. I thought that was really helpful, that I think that it goes against, I think, some of the perceptions and some of that narrative that's there. Yeah. A lot of people are jumping off and we're at noon, but I have to say, I feel like there's so much more in here, and I didn't know if people felt that there was a need to have more of these conversations. I feel a need to have more of these conversations, and I like talking to Diana. So we might, I feel like an interest in doing more of this, and I just like to see if anybody else has anything you want to drop in the chat, or, email us afterwards and see what they think about engaging deeper.
Well, it was great sharing with all of you today and being a part of the conversation. I really appreciated the opportunity.
Well, it's always our pleasure to have you, Diana. And we definitely, Jeffrey says, yes, please, I want some more Oliver, the quote from the musical. So yes, I feel the same way. So thank you everyone for being on today. You can always reach out to Diana at Third Side Consulting, or me, the nonprofit coach. You can go on the website, thenonprofitcoach.guru, and by phone number and email address, elizabethjfinlayson@gmail.com. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.